Twilight had folded itself over the mountains when Adam eased my sedan onto a gravel pull-off above a switchback. Fog braided up from the pines and drifted across the headlights, turning them into two pale discs on a damp curtain. He didn't look at me when he killed the engine. He just sat there with his jaw set, as if a decision had finally clicked into place, and any softness might undo it. "Out," he said, not loud, precise. "Walk the rest. Maybe then you'll start listening." His words were clinical, a diagnosis delivered without a hand to hold. Lila angled toward him from the passenger seat, the corner of her mouth lifting in a satisfied crescent-polished nails, tapping once against the door as if to mark the moment. I watched my son's knuckles blanch around the steering wheel and absurdly remembered the same hands, once slick with finger paint, held up to show me a masterpiece drying under the kitchen fan. I opened the door. Cold air gathered in the car like a tide, and the smell of wet leaves and brake dust followed me out. The gravel was sharp under my shoes. Behind us, the ridgeline was a dark whale's back, the sky a bruise about to break. Lila leaned close to Adam and murmured something only the cadence reached me, triumphant and private. The door thudded shut. The engine turned over, their taillights unspooled down the curve and were gone. I stood very still and let the quiet take shape around me. In the distance, a river shouldered its way through rock. Nearer, rain began in tiny exploratory stitches. Fear arrived as a thought, deliberate and slow. The road was narrow. Trucks might not see me if I tried to navigate the shoulder. I was miles from town with no streetlights, no houses, only a ranger sign half tilted and a picnic table silvered with damp. I did not move. Panic would have fed what Adam had just done. Panic would have made me small. Instead, I listened to the rain building, and confidence listened until it drowned the last thread of engine noise and washed the air clean of them. Then, from a lower turnout screened by laurel, a pair of headlights turned up the grade, calm, deliberate beams that didn't search but confirmed. The pickup crested the bend and rolled to a stop with its tires whispering on the wet gravel. Marcus Hart stepped down, brim of his cap pulled low, water ticking from the bill. He didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't ask what had been said. We had agreed already that asking would dignify Adam's performance more than it deserved. He opened the passenger door. I climbed in and felt the truck's heat wrap itself around my damp sleeves. For a moment, I let my head fall against the rest and closed my eyes, not to sleep but to steady whatever in me had begun to shake. A sound came from my chest that might have been a laugh or a sob cut short. Marcus put the truck in gear. We took the switchbacks at a patient pace, his wipers carving neat parentheses through the fog. The dashboard glow was an old, gentle blue. I watched the needle hover and fall as if the speed itself were breathing with me. He kept the radio off. There was nothing to add to the mountain's voice. Nothing we needed translated into songs and ad copy. The road unwound and the grade softened. We passed a closed ice cream stand, a church lot shining in puddled pools, and a clapboard house whose front room was a square of lamplight, someone's evening intact. By the time we reached Hendersonville, the rain had settled into a steady curtain. Marcus pulled beneath the low eave of a motor court that had been painted the color of robin's eggs, the kind of place where the office smelled faintly of strong coffee and orange cleaner. I signed with my maiden name Wren and accepted a brass key fob without comment. The clerk kept her eyes on the ledger. There are kindnesses that look away at the right time. Inside, the room's heater breathed a warm, thin roar. The carpet had the ghost of ocean waves in its pattern. The bedspread was heavy with the logic of decades. Safety is sometimes nothing more than a door that closes and a deadbolt that decides to work. I hung my coat over the back of a chair and watched rain run down the window like a moving grid. Marcus set his hat on the dresser and studied me with the care of a man who has carried a secret farther than he likes. I figured he'd push, he said, voice low. Just not how. I nodded. Somewhere between the grocery store argument about a bill I had never seen and the brittle apology Adam had offered after misplacing my insurance card, something in me had clicked over from hoping to planning. I had begun carrying my phone differently. I had watched my son's temper come on like weather first, a shift of light, then wind you couldn't name, then the sudden certainty of rain. When he turned onto the overlook and gripped the wheel until the tendons stood like wires, I tapped record. Not because I wanted a trophy of his worst moment, but because words weaponized against you have to be turned back into plain evidence or they keep cutting. I pulled the device from my bag and laid it flat on the small table by the window. The glass showed me two versions of myself, one faint and rippled by rain, one square and resolute in the black phone screen. I pressed play. Static tires on grit door hinges. Then his voice clipped and careful, as if reading from a script he'd practiced in the mirror. Out. Walk it. Maybe respect will find you on the way. We listened once through without speaking. The room seemed to recalibrate around the sound, as if the heater, the rain, my own breath had absorbed a new rhythm and decided to keep it. I stopped the recording and glanced at Marcus. He had already pulled his laptop from its sleeve. 2 copies, 2 places, he said, practical as always, and one for you. He plugged the phone in. On the screen, a progress bar slid forward with stubborn calm. He verified the first transfer, then the second, a cloud vault he maintained for his business, and a mirrored drive in a battered metal case. Finally, he handed me a small brushed steel stick that felt heavier than its size warranted. If anyone tries to make this vanish, he said they'll have to erase it 3 times. I turned the drive in my fingers. My hair had dried in uneven strands. My hands remembered the chill and then forgot it. There was nothing triumphant in me. Only a steadiness I hadn't expected to find tonight, a steadiness that had very little to do with winning and everything to do with naming what had happened so it couldn't be renamed by someone else. Marcus zipped the laptop sleeve. Need anything, he asked. Tea, I said, surprised by the ordinariness of it. He went to the office and came back with 2 paper cups and a handful of sugar packets I would not use. We sat with our coats draped on chairbacks like second bodies drying beside us. The tea tasted vaguely of cardboard and lemon, but it was hot and heat has its own truth. When he left, the room settled deeper into itself. The heater's fan ticked once and then resumed. Somewhere a pipe knocked and then apologized. I stretched out on the bed in my clothes and stared at the ceiling's faint constellations of plaster, each stipple a small insistence. A life is made of these small insistences and also of large refusals. I closed my eyes and saw the bend in the road again, the way Adam's taillights slid red through fog and were swallowed whole. I let the picture stay. I did not bargain with it. I named it what it was and let it take its place in the long file of other true things. At some point, the rain slackened. The room cooled and I pulled the bedspread up to my chin. Sleep stayed just beyond the door listening. I did not chase it. On the table by the window, the phone lay face down on the metal drive. The brass key fob sat beside them, the number stamped into it like a little verdict. In the glass, my reflection was just a darker square against the valley of night, and for the first time in hours, the darkness didn't feel like something that wanted me. It felt like a wall that held. I woke to the heater's thin breath and the steady whisper of tires on wet road, somewhere beyond the cinder block wall. The brass key fob lay on the table where I'd left it beside the phone, and the metal drive, the 3 of them arranged like a small geometry of stubborn things. The tea from the night before had filmed over. I poured it down the sink, rinsed the paper cup, and watched a brown ribbon vanish into the drain. Light came through the curtains the way water seeps through cloth, slow, determined, altering whatever it touches. I dressed in the clothes I'd folded across the chair and pinned my hair back with the plain tortoiseshell comb I've used since I cannot remember when. The mirror offered a practical face, a mouth set as if it understood the math of days like this. When I opened the door, the air smelled of rain and detergent and the faint asphalt sweetness that rises after a storm. The office clerk lifted her chin in a greeting that meant, I see you, and nothing else that would demand an answer. Marcus was already waiting in the truck, a takeout cup steaming in the holder between us. Thought you'd want something hot, he said. It wasn't the tea the motel stocked, but a stout coffee from the diner around the corner, dark enough to feel like a promise. He drove with the same measured patience as the night before, wipers ticking the mountains, rinsed into a cleaner green. We didn't crowd the morning with commentary. We let the day settle on its own feet. Months earlier, when the first odd invoices had arrived, roof repair in a year, the shingles still flashed black-blue in the sun, a condenser replacement, though the old unit ran like a small polite train, I'd put them in a folder labeled with the date and the word why. That label had made me laugh, then a private joke not yet edged with dread. I'd asked Adam about the charges and watched him build irritation like scaffolding, first the impatient sigh, then the little speech about how I never trusted his judgment, then the dismissal. It's done, Mom. I took care of it. That turned a financial question into a moral flaw. It was after the 2nd or 4th of those exchanges, my memory refuses to give me the exact number, that I called an elder law attorney, whose name I'd found in a church bulletin years ago and kept without knowing why. Eleanor Pike's office sat above a bakery on a street with brick sidewalks and uneven slate roofs. The first time I climbed the stairs, the hallway smelled of yeast and cinnamon and something like good paper. Her receptionist, a compact woman with forearms that suggested she could lift a box of files without flinching, had handed me a clipboard and a pen that wrote in a clean, dark line. Eleanor came out to meet me herself. No pretended surprise, no overly warm coo about my courage, just the quick assessment of a professional accustomed to sorting mess from harm. Bring me everything she'd said then. Photocopies of bills, statements, any notes of conversations you remember, times, dates, words. If he's using your accounts, we trace how. If he's using your name, we test the signature. Documentation is oxygen. I had done as she asked. I bought a 3-ring binder and a fistful of white tabs and sat at the kitchen table until the wood warmed beneath my arms. I filled pages with dates and phrases, scraps of remembered inflection, the particular words Adam's voice chose when he wanted to slide my sense of proportion off-center. Stop exaggerating. You forget everything. And then on a later day to Lila on the phone, his voice pitched lower. I've got it. It's mine to manage. The night Adam left me on the overlook, the phone had captured a different kind of sentence. Now in daylight on a street that didn't lean against a ridge, I carried that sound up the narrow staircase above the bakery and set it on Eleanor's polished desk beside the folder marked Y. The bakery's proofing ovens sent a tide of warm air through the vents. Somewhere below us, a timer chimed and was silenced. Eleanor listened, the corners of her mouth drawn down in concentration, the pen in her right hand making patient notes. Her office walls were lined with framed maps of the county, from different decades' boundaries growing and contracting, roads changing their names, the slow choreography of a place that pretends not to be moving. When the recording ended, she rewound without theatrics and listened again to the last 11 seconds, the place where Adam's voice compressed into that round, instructive word walk, and the pause afterward, which was not remorse, simply a neat end to a planned line. She clicked stop and set the phone down as if it were a piece of glass, just cool enough to handle. May I? She asked, turning to the stack I'd brought. I slid the folder forward. She opened to the first tab roof and took in the invoice, a company with a website that looked almost right. A phone number with a Raleigh area code, a signature block rendered in a smooth script that bore my name but not my hand. Eleanor placed the original beside a sample check I had signed, in front of her, then pulled from a drawer a small loop like a jeweler's and examined the loops and breaks. Her finger tapped where my S in Sullivan always falters mid-curve and corrects into a small lift. On the invoice it flowed on, without the hesitation my hand has learned over 50 years. Auto pen or a font overlay, she said. Or someone attempting flourish where yours never did. She glanced up. Who's Lila in the recording? My son's wife, I said. Eleanor nodded once, not to endorse the relationship, but to acknowledge the mapping of names to roles. She turned to tab 2 HVAC, then 3 Foundation, then a sub-tab labeled MESC. I watched as she followed the money into a company that didn't appear in the Secretary of State's registry, then into something that did a boutique called the Citrine Room, incorporated 3 years earlier in the Queen City under Lila's name. A few clicks on her keyboard yielded a cascade of public filings, a commercial lease signed and abandoned, a loan taken and late. The boutique's website now a redirect to a hosting services generic page. Remind me, she said, eyes still on the screen. You didn't authorize any of these repairs. I would have noticed a foundation crew, I said. They'd leave more than a number on a bill. She printed a spreadsheet that mapped invoice dates to withdrawals, withdrawals to transfers, transfers to deposits. She laid it on the desk with the care of someone setting a table for a complicated conversation, then called to her paralegal Koa, a young man whose calm suggested he'd been born with a measuring tape in his mind, and asked him to make 3 sets of the current file. When Koa left, she leaned back the chair's leather, answering in a quiet creak. 2 realities now, she said. What the paper claims and what it shows when you ask it the right questions. We'll need samples of your signature across time, mortgages, tax returns, anything that shows the quirk and the left-hand drag. She paused. Who else knows you're here? Marcus, I said. He's in the truck. Good, she said, as if that single syllable occupied the same shelf as the others labeled evidence and chain of custody. I told her about the folder of why, about the way Adam's temper built from silence, into a tidy lecture about the last argument over an insurance claim I hadn't filed. I told her about Lila's voice behind a half-closed door, the bright, pitying tone she favored when she wanted to sound reasonable. She's smothering you, Adam. If you ever want a life, stop letting her buy it for you. The line had come to me like a draft, slipping under a door, unwanted, and cooling everything in its path. Eleanor made notes as I spoke and then asked for something old. When did the giving begin to feel like erasure, she said, and there was no malice in it, only craft. I described the faff machine that had set up a permanent station in the corner of the kitchen, its motor a domestic weather pattern, under which meals and homework and holidays found their rhythms. I talked about hemming gowns for women who like to stand in their socks and measure themselves against a mirror, about running stitches by the dozen, until my fingerprints grew glossy from the cloth's drag about lying and saying I wasn't hungry, so Adam could lift the lid and take the second ladle of stew. I said the words without ornament. Memory is hard enough to hold without the lace. At some point, Marcus came upstairs. Eleanor greeted him with the nod of one practical person to another. He reported without theatrics what he'd heard months ago at a bar near the river, the station, a place where the beer list is ambitious and the gossip plainer. Adam voice raised over the music, indulging a friend with a story about finally getting to run the old woman's portfolio. He said it the way you'd brag about taking over a small business you think you were born to own. Marcus's mouth made a line that wanted to be kind and could not find a way to be. Qua returned with 3 neat stacks and a small box of binder clips. Eleanor clipped and labeled each set, dated them in her tidy left-leaning script, and slid one across the desk to me. We add to this, she said. We don't subtract. She stood. There's one more thing I want you to consider. Do you and your late husband have any entity-level documents, an operating agreement, a deed stored somewhere safe? Not the copies your son keeps in the kitchen drawer, but the kind that live in metal. I had nearly forgotten the brass key. Not the motel fob, but the smaller one on the ring I hadn't taken off since my husband died, a plain key with a number stamped into it and a dimple where it falls against my car keys. I closed my fingers around it now, surprised by its certainty. There's a box, I said. First time I've thought of it in months. Find it, Eleanor said. If there's an operating agreement, the language may carry teeth. Sometimes a single clause keeps an entire house standing. We left with the file and the recording copy and a second coffee from the bakery, below a sturdy thing flavored by the air's sugar. In the truck, Marcus sat with the keys in his hand, weighing the drive into town against the temper of traffic. I rolled the small brass key across my palm, reading the number as if it were a scripture, a code that had been quietly waiting for a day that looked like this one. Blue Cedar Bank still kept a vault in the back, the old kind with a wheel you can put your hand through, the sort that makes people square their shoulders for reasons they don't name. The clerk, a man in his 50s with sleeves rolled to the elbow and a tie that reminded me of a field in October, checked my name against the card on file, then checked again the second time, more for ceremony than suspicion. He took me past an abstract painting that meant nothing to me and everything to the board, and into a narrow hall where small brass doors waited like a choir holding its breath. The key turned with a satisfying resistance. The attendant slid the long, shallow drawer from its slot and placed it on the table in the booth. He left with the quiet dispatch of someone trained to supply privacy rather than comfort. Marcus sat outside in a chair, set against the wall, hands folded, the brim of his cap tipped in a way that meant he had no intention of watching me and every intention of being near. Inside the box, order had survived grief. The folders were labeled in my husband's handwriting, tidy block letters, precise breaks. Tax returns, mortgage satisfaction wills, plural, because loss had taught him that papers have to be told twice to behave. The last folder was thicker, and the manila had paled at the edges. It read, Wren Cottage, LLC, the name he'd chosen to make a roof and 4 walls and the ground they stood on into something the law would recognize and not try to bend. The operating agreement rode on top its pages, numbered in a fine paralegal hand from a firm that no longer exists under that letterhead. Clause 7.2 was the one that made my throat lose its compass, managing members' exclusive voting rights. There was nothing flowery in the phrasing. It stated in the cool grammar of contracts that I, as the sole managing member, retained exclusive authority over the property and all major decisions related to it, that membership interests could not be transferred without my written consent, and that any attempted assignment without such consent was void. Beneath the agreement lay the deed to the bungalow, stamped and recorded the red inked seal, giving the pale paper something like a pulse. There was also a letter in my husband's hand, 2 paragraphs, not dramatic, not predictive, only careful. Keep these in the box, it said. Not because we don't trust, but because trust should never have to carry more than it can lift. If you're reading, you'll know why I was such a nag about metal and keys. I read it twice and then set it back exactly where it had been resting for years, as if waking it fully might misalign something I couldn't name. I carried the operating agreement and the deed out to the attendant, who made certified copies and stamped each page with a care that turned ink into a small ceremony. He asked if I wanted a glass of water. I did. It tasted faintly of the cold pipes that had been drinking from the same line for decades. When we stepped back into sunlight, the rain had been burnt off the sidewalks by a shy early warmth. Marcus didn't ask what the paper said. He didn't need to. The way I held the folder telegraphed enough. At a stoplight, a boy in a school hoodie crossed on the walk with a backpack low on his shoulders and his head cocked as if listening to instructions from somewhere just behind him. My hand tightened around the folder and then released. The light changed. We drove on. I didn't go back to the motel right away. The room had been a bridge across the night. Morning demanded a room with bigger light. Eleanor's office had that light. We returned to the bakery stairs and carried the folder as if it was something that could change weight if you let your hands get careless. She took the agreement in both palms and read aloud the clauses that mattered while Koa copied, annotated, and numbered. Marcus stood by the window with his hat in his hands, looking out over the street where a delivery truck made delicate work of a bad angle. Eleanor turned to me. This language is not performative, she said. It's structural. If anyone's been acting as if they have authority you didn't grant, the paper will not agree with them. I nodded. There was nothing to add. The agreement did not rescue me. It recognized me. It did not bless me. It instructed whoever needed reminding that the bungalow and the plot beneath it had always answered to a single specific pen. A text came in on my phone. The number was one I knew but rarely saw outside birthdays and holidays. Noah. He is 12 and thin, the way middle school makes you, before you discover the weight you'll carry and the weight you won't. The message was an image-aligned notebook page torn from the middle edges still furred where the spiral binds. In pencil he'd written, "Dad keeps saying you're not thinking right. I don't think that's true. I don't want to be mean. I just want you to know." There was a small drawing of a baseball in the bottom corner, not good, not bad. Simply earnest 2 curved lines and stitches he'd fussed over until their length matched. I didn't answer right away. I set the phone face down for a moment and watched the light on the wood around it. There are words that ask you to choose between speed and care. I chose care. Then I typed, "Thank you for telling me what you see." I added nothing else that would drag him into an explanation he wasn't ready to make. Eleanor copied the agreement's key page one more time and slid the original back into my folder with the reverence of someone returning an instrument to its case. When she looked up, she studied my face and found whatever it was she needed to find there, because she only said, "Qua will index what we have so far. If more documents surface, we add them to the spine." On the way out, the smell of cinnamon caught us again. Marcus bought a single roll, handed me half, and ate his share without ceremony, the icing making a small white comet on his knuckle. He wiped it with a napkin he folded into a square and put in the truck's door pocket as if he might need paper later that didn't have ink and clauses all over it. We drove the long way back to the motor court, not to delay anything, but because the long way crosses the river twice and I like the way water makes my mind remember how to measure. At a red light, a street preacher lifted a hand and closed his eyes and said something only the 2 people in front of him were meant to hear. A dog in the next car over stood with his paws on the window and watched the light as if he could teach it patience. In the room, the heater had taken a nap and woke with a rattle. I set the folder on the table beside the brass key and the drive and the phone and felt the alignment of those 4 things draw a straight, unmistakable line through the day. I didn't invent the line, and I didn't need to be clever about it. Paper is not clever. It is specific. Names, dates, clauses, signatures with their hesitations in the places your hand always hesitates. I took the comb from my hair and laid it beside the other objects, something ordinary to remind the rest that all of this lives in a room where people put clothes on hangers and fold socks into each other and drink coffee that tastes faintly of whatever cup the clerk could find. Then I sat and I let my breathing learn again how to take its time. The window had cleared, and beyond the parking lot, a line of poplars flashed pale undersides like a school of fish turning at once. I thought of the faff on the kitchen table and the thrum that had laid down a rhythm beneath years that now seemed to exist in 2 overlapping drafts, one written in a hand that had been told what to write, the other in my own. There are days that have a hinge. This was one. Not because it swung anything fully open or closed, but because it located the pin on which the door actually turns. I did not say that aloud. I didn't need to. The folder on the table said it for me, in the only language it respects names, numbers, and the clause that keeps a roof from answering to a voice that never signed for it. I set the folder on the motel's desk and opened it one more time before we left operating agreement on top deed beneath Eleanor's index tabs, marching like careful vertebrae down the margin. Marcus waited at the door with his hat in his hands, not fidgeting, just holding the brim like it steadied the morning's balance. The heater's breath thinned and stopped. I slid the brass key into my pocket, closed the folder, and we walked out into the air that had finally remembered how to be clear. The courthouse sat on a rise above the river, all columns and glass, and the kind of silence that belongs to places where voices carry in straight lines. Inside, the marble reflected footsteps into a brighter register. We found Eleanor just past the magnetometers, already moving through the day like a person who trusts her paperwork. She lifted her gaze to meet mine, and then to Marcus, a small acknowledgement that took the edge off the building's geometry. In the gallery outside our courtroom, a woman in a navy suit checked a calendar. A bailiff stood with his hands behind his back, resting into a posture he could hold for hours. The door swung open for a previous case faces, pinched with the concentration that comes from waiting your turn to be told what your life is called. When the room emptied enough, we took seats at the petitioner's table. Eleanor's legal pad lay square with the edge. Her pen waited in a parallel line. I set the folder down to her right, the way she'd shown me to make the reach shorter when her hands wanted the next page. Adam arrived with his lawyer late by the small measure of people who like to be seen entering. He had on the gray jacket I'd bought him for a wedding 3 summers ago, the one he said made him look like he had a plan. Lila walked at his side, mouth glossy blazer tailored to an outline she believed in. They took the respondent's table. Adam kept his eyes forward with an effort I recognized from childhood, the one that used to come before tears he didn't want anyone to see. Now it read as anger looking for a holster. Noah sat in the second row behind them, a backpack at his feet. He kept his head down, but when I turned to glance back, I caught the quick lift of his eyes, the unshowy recognition people exchange when they are not allowed to do more. The clerk called the case. The judge entered from the door behind the bench, a woman whose hair had gone the color of pewter and who wore her robe like a garment she'd tailored herself for fit rather than spectacle. The room rose and sat. She read the caption, confirmed the parties, and looked over the rims of her glasses with the steadiness of someone who can make time obey. "Ms. Pike," she said to Eleanor, "whenever you're ready." Eleanor stood. She did not clear her throat. She did not perform the small courtesies some attorneys use to warm up a room. She said my name, and then the words seeking injunctive relief and restoration of exclusive control consistent with governing documents. She laid out in sentences that sounded like they had been measured against a ruler the scope of what we were asking, the property called Wren Cottage, held in an LLC of the same name with me as the managing member, financial irregularities charged to my accounts without consent, an audio recording relevant to the court's assessment of coercion and abandonment. She did not raise her voice for the last phrase. She did not need to. She asked permission to play the recording. The judge nodded. A small speaker became the room's center. Eleanor set my phone face up, tapped once, and stepped back. For a moment there was only texture tires on grit, a door hinge articulating itself, the hush of fog pressed against a car. Then Adam's voice came out, in that clipped, instructive tone he must have thought sounded adult. "Out. Walk it. Maybe respect will find you on the way." The silence afterward was not dramatic. It was exact. I felt the air measure itself and stop counting. The judge's expression did not flinch. She made one note and looked to the respondent's table. "Counsel," she said. Adam's lawyer, a man with white hair, groomed to argue its own experience, rose and began with the words, "People choose when they want to sand the edges off an action context as a misunderstanding family matter." He gestured toward the speaker as if it had overstated its case. He said the road was near a trailhead. He said tempers rise and fall. He suggested that a son's frustrated words are not the same as malice, that my memory had shown frailties in the past. Eleanor waited for his sentences to finish their own momentum. Then she set the invoices on the rail, one by one, the roof repair bill. With its pretty cursive where my hand always hesitates, the HVAC replacement that had been entered exactly 2 days after the Adam moved our thermostat into some smart home app. I never learned to like the foundation reinforcement with its digital signature that flowed like a font rather than a hand. She brought the spreadsheet next, a map that took us from those invoices to withdrawals, and from withdrawals to a boutique account in the Queen City, registered to Lila the Citrine Room, closed last winter with a lease default and a lender still waiting to be paid. "Public filings," Eleanor said, and placed the printout so the judge could see the dates without leaning. No Secretary of State registration for the supposed contractor. Trace transfers to a retail entity run by Ms. Hart. She paused just long enough to let the names assemble into a sentence. "My client did not authorize these expenditures. Her signature is not her signature." The judge lifted the loop she kept at the bench. This was not the first time someone had brought her a forged curve or a flourish where a shake should be and studied the swoop of my S. She looked not at novelty, but at rhythm. "Counsel for respondent," she said. "Do you contest that the funds landed where counsel has indicated?" Adam's lawyer said language about agents, about proxies, about implied consent. He was careful not to be too specific. The room knows when specificity is a cliff. "We'll move next," Eleanor said, already turning the page to the operating agreement governing the entity that holds title to the property at issue. She lifted the Wren Cottage LLC binder with the kind of respect reserved for the paper that actually runs the house. Certified copy, original available for in-camera review if the court wishes. She flipped to the clause we had studied until its numbers were part of my breath. Section 7.2, Managing Members' Exclusive Voting Rights. My client is and has been since formation the sole managing member. No transfers of membership interest permitted without her written consent. Any attempted assignment without that consent is void. Deed recorded page and book as stamped on the copy before the court. No. She did not look at Adam when she said void. She looked at the judge, who looked back with a kind of quiet appreciation that people reserve for rules that still do what they were written to do. Adam shifted in his chair. His mouth flattened into a refusal shaped like a line. Lila's eyes kept moving first to the ceiling's grid, as if the answer might be hidden there, then to the door, behind the bench that leads nowhere. Anyone is allowed to go, and finally to the floor, the polish there reflecting the room right side up and upside down at once. "Mr. Hart," the judge said, not turning her head from the clause, "who has been authorizing vendors on your mother's accounts." Adam lifted his chin. The question lodged in the place where defiance used to be cute, and now was only thin. "I've been helping," he said, making the word work too hard. My memory can recite the account numbers I said before Eleanor could touch my sleeve. My voice sounded like it does when I line up the hem of a dress under the needle, sure, without trying to be loud. It can also tell you what the kitchen ceiling looked like in the year he says the roofers came: no tarps, no ladders, no boots at the door, no grit in the sink. And it can tell you that helping never meant moving money you don't own to pay for a store you can't keep. The judge didn't ask me to be quiet. She let the words take their weight and then set them down. "Thank you, Ms. Sullivan," she said, using my surname, the way rules use their subjects when they're keeping things in the right order. Eleanor placed the deed on the rail, the red seal catching light. She offered the original to the clerk for inspection. The judge considered both documents, then set them in a neat stack and looked out over the room. "All right," she said. "Here's what I'm finding today." Her voice did not harden, it clarified. On this record, audio evidence of abandonment at an isolated location, financial records indicating transfers without consent, and governing documents demonstrating exclusive authority, resting with the petitioner, the court grants temporary injunctive relief. Joint accounts named in the pleadings are frozen pending a full accounting. Exclusive possession and control of the property held by Wren Cottage LLC are restored to the managing member, Ms. Sullivan, effective immediately. Further, a stay-away order issues as to Mr. Hart and Ms. Hart with a perimeter of 200 yards from Ms. Sullivan's residence and person except as otherwise ordered for any supervised contact that may be arranged in separate proceedings. She looked down at the pad. "We'll set a review in 30 days. Counsel coordinate with the clerk for copies today." The gavel didn't crack so much as land. The room breathed again. Adam's hand hit the table once before he could stop it. The sound made Noah's shoulders jump. Lila reached for Adam's sleeve and touched fabric instead of skin, her fingers pinching the wool as if she was measuring an armhole she didn't know how to finish. We stood. The clerk handed Eleanor stamped copies with embossed seals that made the paper feel denser than its weight. Eleanor checked each page for the block she wanted to see and slid the packet into the folder in a new section she labeled in pencil orders. As the room thinned, Noah stayed seated. People rose and angled past him the way water goes around a stone that refuses to move. When there was a pocket of space, he looked up. I lifted my hand in a small motion that meant not greeting permission. He stood and moved one step, then another, until he was close enough that I could see the freckles the summer had left on the bridge of his nose. "Grandma," he said, voice low. "Hello, Noah," I said. He swallowed. "Do you need?" He glanced at the folder. The question shifted in him and settled into something he could carry. "I'm glad you're okay." "Thank you," I said. I did not reach for him. Rules hang their own signs in rooms like this. He nodded and returned to his seat without being hurried or pulled, which was its own kind of grace. In the corridor, the light felt less like a stage and more like weather. Marcus stood between me and the elevator as if nothing so obvious as blocking were happening, only someone pausing to make sure the people he walked with were not about to be bumped by the wrong conversation. Adam came out with his lawyer moving close, saying words men say when they want prosody to calm a tide. Appeal misunderstanding temporary. Lila's mouth had lost its shine. She avoided my eyes with the diligence of a person who understands the line between insisting and inviting correction. "Ms. Sullivan," a voice said behind me. A woman in a charcoal suit held a business card in one hand and a file in the other. She introduced herself as an assistant district attorney. Her manner was the opposite of theatrical, no wideness, no comforting tilt. The card listed her name, Caroline Yates, and the unit she worked in. Her attention had the steadiness of someone who has been trained to hear the part of a story that isn't embellished. "Your counsel sent over materials this morning," she said to Eleanor. "We've reviewed the financials and the recording. On their face, they touch on statutory definitions we take seriously." She didn't inflate the language. "We're opening a file. I'll need certified copies of the documents you brought into court, and if available, any additional statements from bank personnel. You'll receive a contact sheet before you leave the building." Eleanor nodded. "We have duplicates," she said, and handed over a packet Koa had prepared, corners sharp tabs, labeled in a hand so tidy it could have been a font if it hadn't been so human. "Thank you," the ADA said, and met my eyes only long enough to make the acknowledgement square. "If anyone contacts you or comes to the residence in a way that concerns you, call the number on the card. Don't wait to decide if it qualifies." Her shoes made a soft sound on the floor as she walked away. Marcus exhaled in a way that folded the air and put it back. Outside, the sun had leaned into the day, not with heat but with precision, painting the courthouse steps and leaving the shade to do its own work along the hedges. Eleanor handed me my copy of the order. The seal made a small raised circle under my fingers like a knot in wood. I slid the papers into the folder and balanced the weight against my hip. We crossed the square without speaking. Across the street, a man carried a saxophone case that held itself like a promise. The river threw a little light up where it turned. A delivery truck idled at the curb and then moved on. The building behind us kept its columns and its fog of words. I kept the folder. Marcus opened the truck door. The hinge had been oiled sometime in the past year, and it remembered how to oblige. I sat with the folder on my lap, not to guard it, but because it belonged where my hands could feel it. Eleanor stood with one hand on the door and one on the frame, something like a bookend to the morning. "You have what you need for now," she said, and there was no swell in it, just a statement in the key she uses for facts. Marcus pulled into traffic. The courthouse receded without drama. Noah and his backpack were a small figure on the steps, not waving, not turned away, just placed in the world, in a way that made sense to him. A breeze lifted the hair at the back of my neck and set it down again. I watched the river hold the light and release it, hold it and release it, a practice the water had cultivated long before any of us learned to make a case for ourselves on paper. Marcus drove the long way home following the river until the water's skin turned from bright to quiet. I held the folder against my thigh and felt the raised seal through the manila, a small topography that told my hand where we were. When we turned onto my street, the poplars on the verge flipped their pale undersides in a light wind, as if the day were taking a breath and letting it out without hurry. Inside the house has the paused feeling rooms take on when they've been waiting for their name to be said again. Dust had settled where picture frames meet the wall. The kitchen window showed a rectangle of yard where the grass had found its own rules. I set the folder on the table, smoothed the deeds copy flat, and stood for a long minute with my palm on the paper. Marcus checked the back door and then the front, his movements unshowy and exact. The locksmith came before dark, a compact woman with a toolbox that clicked like punctuation when she set it down. She replaced the cylinders, handed me new keys, and tested each turn twice. "They sit right," she said, listening to the bolt seat itself. The sound marked the room the way a downbeat does when a band falls into time. Marcus returned the old tumblers to her cloth bag as if even the parts we were done with deserved a careful goodbye. I moved through the drawers the way a person reacquaints herself with a language she used to speak without thinking. Utility bills. Insurance statements. The little stack of index cards where I used to write grocery lists in pencil and erase what I changed my mind about. I called customer service numbers and waded through music meant to soothe people who have been told to hold. When the agents asked for names, I gave mine. When they asked for authorization, the order did the talking in its clear, embossed voice. By evening, paper and screen agreed in the places that mattered. Noah arrived the next afternoon with 2 grocery bags that bent his elbows more than he wanted to show. "I brought things we actually eat," he said, and listed them like a person presenting a proof: eggs, rice, oranges, the bread with the heel, you can butter without tearing. He moved through the kitchen as if it might startle, then relaxed when the cabinet doors opened exactly where he remembered they would. We cooked without flourishes eggs, folded soft rice steaming in its pot, and ate at the table that had regained its purpose. He told me about a math teacher who draws triangles so precisely the chalk squeaks, and about a teammate who can throw a curve that looks like mercy until it arrives. When he left, he put his palm flat on the newel post and said goodnight to the house under his breath. The knock came 3 nights later, hard familiar. Adam's voice followed, pitched to Carrie. "Open up, Mom. This is ridiculous." The part of my body that once rose to that tone out of habit did not move. Marcus reached the door first and stood in the frame without widening his shoulders. "You've got the order," he said. "Respect the line." Lila's voice drifted from the porch, thin with anger the way paper sounds when it's tugged too hard. I stepped up beside Marcus so Adam could see my face. "Not tonight," I said, and closed the door with the gentleness you use for something fragile. The latch caught. The house held. He came again a week later after dark, voice larger fist, landing on wood enough times that the neighbor's porch light flicked on like a question. This time the squad car turned the corner before the knocking had finished becoming a pattern. The officer spoke to Adam in a calm that was not negotiable. A second officer asked me if I was safe, and I said yes, with a steadiness that felt like standing on a dock after a storm and finding the boards dry. When the cuffs went on, there was no spectacle in it. The cruiser's reflector strips caught the street lamp and returned it in patient rectangles across the yard. Paper continued to do its work. Lila's lawyer called Eleanor to discuss terms the way people do when facts have settled into a shape that won't be sanded down. The boutique's records opened receipts and transfers like a flock finally deciding to land. A settlement came with language that didn't pretend to be kind. She moved her boxes out of the apartment across town and left a set of keys on a counter that was no longer hers to touch. Noah began to spend Friday nights here, his backpack traded for a smaller one that meant he intended to stay until Sunday. We found the old board game with half its money missing and played with the numbers we had. We walked the creek path where sycamore bark peels away in big, satisfying maps. We weeded a narrow strip of garden until the soil lay black and open, ready to accept what we'd ask it to hold. He didn't ask me for explanations I couldn't give. He watched the way the new keys turned and learned the quiet the house made when it trusted the door. One morning I woke and couldn't stand the thought of silence belonging only to me. I called the senior center on Market and asked about reserving the hall. On the flyer we printed, the headline was "Plain Understanding Your Papers." The day the doors opened, the room filled with people carrying folders exactly like mine, some crisp with tabs, some soft from years in drawers. Eleanor stood at the front with a stack of handouts about deeds and operating agreements and what a signature owes the hand that writes it. A young banker explained account authorizations and how to read a statement without looking away from the parts you don't like. Marcus poured coffee. I watched faces tilt toward the material the way flowers tilt toward a window that remembers the sun. When the questions were done and the applause settled into chatter, I walked the rows collecting spare pens and left behind printouts. A woman touched my sleeve. "I didn't know what to call the thing that felt wrong," she said. "Now I have a name for it." I nodded. Names hold a shape long enough for you to see it. Back home, I framed the certified copy of the deed and hung it in the living room, where the light shifts across the wall in the late afternoon. It wasn't a trophy. It was a label the way you label jars, so you don't have to open them to learn what's inside. Noah did homework at the table, pencil tapping a rhythm that belonged to concentration and not impatience. Marcus came by with a small key in his palm. "The spare," he said. I turned it over once and pressed it back into his hand. "You keep it," I said. He slipped it into his pocket as if the pocket had been expecting it. I stood on the porch with the new lock warm under my thumb and let the day sort itself in front of me. Kids walking home with damp hair from practice, the mail truck's steady progress, a dog asleep on a square of sun. The framed deed hung inside doing its quiet work. The key in my pocket made the right weight against my leg. The house breathed. So did I. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.